Ask the Podcast Coach for April 22nd, 2023.
Let's get ready to podcast.
There it is. It is Saturday morning. It is time for Ask the Podcast Coach, where you get your podcast questions answered live. I'm Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting.com, and joining me right over there is the one and only Jim Cullison from theaverageguy.tv. Jim, how's it going, buddy?
Greetings, Dave. Happy Saturday morning to you. Good to be back, and big thanks to Uncle Mar filling in for me last week. It's been a tough week for both of us.
Yeah,
and always great. David Hooper sent me a note. I appreciate the community, and it's just always tough to lose a pet or an uncle.
Yeah.
In your case, and so I appreciate Mar filling in for me.
Yeah, I always tell like clients and new podcasters when they're practicing. Like, I don't know, what should I record? I'm like, well, you need to do something with your equipment. And I'm always like, go interview your parents and go interview. And man, years ago, my uncle was 98. He had all these World War II stories. The cool thing about my mom's side of the family is you keep your marbles and you live to be like, I had an aunt that was 101. So they live forever. And the little voice in my head was like, you know what? You should get a microphone.
Yeah.
And just spend a weekend, and I didn't, and now I can't. And I was like, yeah. So
it is hard. This cat was 20 years old. I mean, most people, our friends thought he was going to be eternal. It's just like he was never. And we the family just deeply loved this cat. It was right about this time last Saturday that we were able to do it at home and put him away. So it's been a tough week, but it should be. Like, those are things you should feel and experience them. I think sometimes we try to dismiss it or not feel the pain, and I think part of the healing process is feeling that. And so, anyway, it's been a tough week, but it's good to get back in rhythm as well. And so we're back in rhythm this week. So thanks to everybody who reached out. Appreciate it.
And of course, sometimes it's hard to sleep, and you might get tired, and what could perk you up. That's right. An awesome coffee pour there. And that coffee pour is brought to you by our good friend Mark over at podcastbranding.co. If you want to look good, it's super simple. Podcastbranding.co. Just remember that website because not only is Mark an award-winning graphic artist, but he's also a podcaster. And he's going to sit down with you. So somebody on Fiverr is not going to do that. He's going to sit down with you. He's going to listen to your show. He's going to look at your website. If you don't have a website, he'll build you one. So whatever it means to look professional, whatever it means to make a great first impression, Mark has got you covered. And I just love his personal touch. He's done multiple pieces of artwork for me, Ask the Podcast Coach, Podcast Rodeo Show, School of Podcasting. So I'm not saying this because Mark is paying me. Well, I am, but also I'm saying this because he's good. So if you want to look good, because remember, they see you before they hear you, podcastbranding.co.
Of course, big thanks to our friend, not our friend, but our friend, Dan Lefebvre over there, Based on a True Story podcast at basedonatruestorypodcast.com. 2 new episodes since I was out last week. 240. He covers Apollo 13, The Conspirator, and Titanic. And then this last week, The Conspirator, Pearl Harbor, and The Red Baron. So if you need something new to listen to, if you want to see, is it based on a true story or how close is it? You can check it out, basedonatruestorypodcast.com. Dan?
Well, that wasn't very nice. You can finish your sentence now. Dan, thanks.
Thanks for your Dan, thanks for your sponsorship.
I went to do this and remove the slide and instead removed you. I was like, that was kind of nice.
Okay. I pinged Dan. He's going to be coming on Home Gadget Geeks later in the spring here. He's just he's kind of a geeky kind of guy, and it just has got a lot of good things to say and does a really nice job on his podcast. So we're going to have him on and talk some gadgetry on Home Gadget Geeks.
Awesome. Speaking of talking, if you have a question, you can ask it in the chat room if you're watching live at askthepodcastcoach.com/live, or you can go to askthepodcastcoach.com/join and jump right into the video. Before I get to my first topic, Dan talked about the Titanic. Have you ever heard that the Titanic had a sister ship, whatever it was? We'll call it Marge. I don't know what it was, but the captain of Marge kept wrecking it. And so what they did, and they couldn't get the insurance money. So the conspiracy is they swapped the names on the boat. So really the Titanic was Marge.
I got it. Okay.
And it was a planned wreck because there was a boat off the coast. And I didn't believe it.
Wow.
I saw that on Amazon. I was like, that's a cool conspiracy theory. And then I forget, I got to quit telling the story because I can remember there's a super big bank that, like, when all the banks were going out of business, and there was something with like 2 letters in a bank. It's like JD Power Writer, but that's a car dealer here in Akron. But forget what it was. But when I heard that name, I was like, I might believe that now because that bank is like buku rich. But anyway, meanwhile, back in the world of podcasting, I had a question that I was like, So here it is. You have a brand new podcaster. They're getting ready to launch, and what is your top piece of advice? And you can only give one. And I saw this. I think it was Deidre from Cap Show was in some group or something like this, and asked that question. I was like, because there's part of you wants to jump in and go, oh, get this microphone, and then maybe don't forget it's a marathon, not a sprint, et cetera, et cetera. So what say you, Jim Cullison?
Well,
it's a tough question.
It is hard because there isn't one thing about it that will be the magic, right? There's so many, there's kind of so many pieces that go around it. I think you gotta ask that question of what do you really want to do? I mean, be really clear on what you're trying to achieve with this. And if it's just for fun, it's great. If you want to sell things with it, awesome. If you want to create community, great. But I think going in, having some really defined, like, here are some metrics and some things that I want to do with it. I know when I'm achieving it. And just knowing the why, getting to that, I'm not a big fan of that book because that's kind of like thanks, Captain Obvious. But I don't think we spend enough. I don't think we spend enough time like, what do we want to achieve with this thing? Why are we doing it? And I think that's what I'd say, Dave. What about you?
I go back and forth between both of these because one is why. I think mine is who, like, know your audience. And the reason for that, I think that's a good place to start because it doesn't matter if I have $1 million worth of equipment. It doesn't matter if I have an assistant who's doing social for me. It doesn't matter how great my website looks like. You know what I mean? Because if I've attracted a bunch of 70-year-old widows, and I'm making content for 30-year-old, whatever, like, I'm giving them the wrong content, and it doesn't matter how much gas I pour on this fire. It's just not going to burn.
Yeah.
So, I'd say that's the top two. You got to know who when you start, and you got to know why, because the why keeps you going. So if the why is, well, I want to get more clients, and you do this for a month and a half and you get a client, you're like, oh, cool, this is working. You could care less what your downloads are. You're getting your why. Now, if your why is, well, and I hear this so often, I'm going to start a podcast and get ads. And I'm not anti-ad. I do get a little flustered when you stuff 15 of them at the beginning of your show. Said the guy who
yeah, but like, it does that, we say that from time to time. And I always think of my friends, Dave Groffalo over there at Scar Authority.
Yeah.
And like, they have 3 gigantic ad segments where they do 7 or 8 ads. And they just keep doing it, and it works, and people listen to them, and the sponsors keep paying for them. Dave just keeps billing them. So I don't think that's always a reason. I think sometimes we think, oh, if I have more than one ad, it's never going to work. Well, Who's your audience? What are you doing? What are they expecting? What are you trying to do with it? I mean, man, if you've got advertisers and they're paying you, and the goal is to get advertisers, okay, this is going to sound, but who cares what the audience thinks if the advertisers keep paying you, right?
Well,
it really doesn't matter at that point for most, in most cases.
and that's it. There are, again, it goes back to your why. So if your why is I want to make money from advertising, if you can do it, you're successful.
Yeah, no,
I
right
have.
on.
I remember I interviewed a guy, and at the time I was like, "How dare you?" But his whole thing was he was interviewing people that should be his clients, and I was like, "Okay, but like, what about the content? Like, what about who's listening?" And he was kind of like, "Meh." He's like, "All I know is I have people now that wouldn't talk to me will come on my podcast. I start to build a relationship with them. And once we hit stop on the record, he goes, I kind of ask him, hey, have you ever thought of doing this? Because we do that. And he goes, and it works. Okay.
Mhm.
So there's part of me, and I've loved this. I always worried about, well, then you're putting out junk into the podcast space. What if some new wannabe listener finds your show and it's awful? And look, trust me on this. Oh, I actually went looking for a podcast. This is the next episode of the School of Podcasting is about this. I went looking for a specific type of podcast on a specific topic. There is so many shows out there that are dead. Like one episode, maybe two, peace out. They're on, Spotify for podcasters and they're done. So there's that, and there's also a lot of really, in my opinion, and most of it's really bad audio. Or, look, this morning was special. We started off with a little tribute to those who have fallen, but there are a lot of people that it's bad audio, and they're just jibber jabbering about whatever. Like they can't figure out. At least we had a topic. They're doing the pre-planning, the pre-recording planning meeting in the recording. And so if you're thinking of starting a podcast, I'm here to tell you there isn't the competition isn't as stiff as you think it is. So if you know your why and you're getting it, I always say, if the guy that wants to do I had a guy that contacted me, said, I want to do a show about comic books. And he goes, I know there's a million of them. He goes, but everybody in my family is like, I don't want to talk about comic books. And so he started a podcast, found other people who wanted to talk about comic books. Congratulations. Your show's a success, because that's what he wanted to do.
Yeah, no, right on.
So
Right on. Well, and I think over time things change. Like you grow.
Yeah.
Your the situation, I think about folks who started podcasts around the Marvel movies, 10 years ago. And those evolved and then de-evolved. And like today, they're okay, you're only gonna have maybe a core audience that still even cares about those movies anymore, or they've changed or whatever, or so things. I know, at Gallup, but we probably hit the heyday, and I've been doing that for 10 years. We probably hit the heyday in 2021. So during the pandemic, we doubled our output. Lots of content, lots of listeners, lots of activity around those, lots of traction. But as 2022 and 2023 now have moved on, not quite the emphasis. Everybody got busy again. Not quite as many listeners, not quite the focus on it. Now I'm kind of glad, because my role in my role, I'm actually overseeing this new process rollout. And it hasn't gone, I know, surprise, a software implementation that doesn't go as well as you think it should. And I've been heads down 6 weeks, and I probably have another 6 or 12 weeks of work to do on this. It actually comes at a good time so that I can focus on, I've backed off what we're doing from a live perspective. When we run out of things to do, I'm going to repurpose some content that we covered. We had so much content in 2021. Like, I know people didn't listen to it, and it's still valid today.
Yeah.
So we'll pull it back. I'll do a little radio lab. Hey, Jim here. This is an interview we did back in 2020. It's still relevant today. I'd love to have you listen to it. Boom. We'll go into it, and then we'll just republish it. Right. It's a good time for me to kind of republish some things and to think about it. Focus on the community. And to be honest, I'd lost a little bit of my luster on that. I kind of found myself like not as excited as I used to be. Maybe it's time to take some time off, right? Just get away from it for a while. Focus on something different. And so that's a real for me, that's a real life thing that's happening right now. Struggled with my own podcast with the Home Gadget Geeks as well. We're getting back on track, but things change, right? And so thinking about it doesn't always have to be at the same pace, I guess is what I'm saying. Doesn't always, you have to kind of feel what's going on, and it doesn't always have to be at the same pace.
Yeah, I know. There's a really popular show, the Darknet Diaries. Jack Reischer does that, and he took like a month off. And when he came back, he was like, I just needed some time off, because the problem is when you really get a big show and then you get sponsors, you kind of have to make your show whether you want to do it or not, because, well, you've got a contract, and his show is highly produced and a lot of work. And, so he kind of was just like, yeah, it's like that band that's on tour. They're like, the manager's like, hey, when you guys get off tour, we got to get you back in the studio. And he's like, no, when I get off tour, when I get done with this, season or whatever he was doing, he's like, I need some time to just chill for a bit. So, keep that in mind. We do have some questions from the chat room. How do I get better speaking on a podcast? Stuttering, pausing, mispronouncing words, talking too fast. Well, number one, here's the thing. It's not radio. So take that pressure that's on your shoulders and you're like, oh man, and just forget about it, because you can edit it out. And then how do you get better at anything? I use the analogy now. I thought about this. When I learned how to drive, I would go to an empty parking lot with my mom or dad, and I would drive around. Now, I wouldn't go anywhere, and I'd waste some time, and I'd waste some gas. But eventually, when I was good enough in the parking lot, I was then ready to go out to the public streets. And that's kind of how it is with podcasting. So David Hooper talks about how he'll just grab something and read it into a microphone as practice. So, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice. So how do you get better speaking on a microphone? You practice. When I go back and listen to the early stuff I did, 10 years ago, I'm horrible. Well, I'm not horrible. I just sound different. And you just kind of get used to doing it. And he says, I'm not looking to be perfect, which is good, because if you are, have fun with that. But would like to improve. English is my first language, so it isn't that. So then the other thing is, I realize when I say seesaw, there are probably people that have no idea what I'm talking about. I think seesaws have been outlawed because they're kind of dangerous, because you could launch your friend into like next week. But it's basically a board, and you would sit on this end, it would make the other end go up. And so I always say, things like that, it's like a seesaw. So less planning equals, more editing, more planning equals less editing. So that's something that can come up as well. But in the end, go ahead.
Yeah, I do. I love your practice comment. Like, people always say, how do I get better? You got to practice. You got to here's the hard part. The practicing's easier than you think. I think some people think it's hard, but that's easier. The hard part is the feedback. When you need to get it in front of people and say, hey, how'd I do? How can I improve? You yourself need to listen to it. I think this is the most underrated component of practice, is that you actually have to, like, it's hard to listen for you to listen to it. You're going to record it. Most people don't want to hear it again. It's just, and you have to go back and listen to yourself. I know you're going to go back and edit this thing, but you got to go back and listen to yourself critically and say, yeah, where could I get better? Like, how could I improve on this? Don't edit in the early days, maybe edit some of those kinds of things out, but actually treat yourself like you're the coach for yourself. You have to kind of disconnect emotions at that point and be like, hey, what if this was just somebody else? Yeah, give it a couple days on that one. But what if this was somebody else? What kind of advice would I give them? And then write some of those things down and actually physically work on some of those. I tell people all the time, if you're going to live read your intro, you got to practice that thing like 100 times. You got to get good at saying what you're saying. I'd memorize it in some way so I could dance around it. But you got to go back and practice and get some really valid input from people. Dave, the thing I see that happens is people do these and then they get feedback from their audience, and then they read that feedback on the show and ridicule it. Like, oh, I'm not gonna, so and so doesn't like the way I do this, and well, they can go to hell, and you're like, well, okay, that's probably not the right way to handle your feedback when you're getting it from your audience. Thank them for it. Think about it. Doesn't mean you always have to follow it. Listen, I get some feedback all the time, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to do that because that's just not me. But don't ridicule the feedback. Don't get bitter about it. Don't fire back emails, angry emails to them saying, you're totally wrong. Just say, hey, thank you for your feedback. I appreciate that. I'll consider it.
Yeah. Jim and I had a guy wrote a book of feedback, and it was well thought out, and he'd gone back through old episodes and stuff. The only problem with the feedback was he kind of wanted a completely different show. He wanted to like interview people and stuff. I'm like, no, this is a Q&A thing. So again, we didn't go, what are you talking about? It was just like, hey, thanks so much for taking the time to put that together. We really appreciate it, and we'll consider it. And we considered it and went, yeah, that's not really where we want to go. But we appreciate the fact that he took the time. So
I've got some feedback for the scroller, because people get confused on this thing. Sometimes it says join the call, and they think we just had somebody do this, or they think, oh, to just listen, I can go to askthepodcastcoach.com/join. I think I might say something like this, Dave. Got a question? ? Join us, or use this. It's maybe it breaks down at that point, but got a question? Ask it. Something like that, something like that along those lines. Now, it doesn't happen often, but it is one of those kinds of things where I think it can be a little confusing for folks when they say it says, join the call. I think this is one of those areas where we're talking about getting very,
I changed it and it didn't save. I was like, well,
getting very specific with what your call to action needs to be super specific and well thought out.
And actually, I changed the call to show. This call kind of might make people think it's a phone number or something like that.
Yeah.
So
maybe just got a question. Join the show. What needs then it needs a comma from a grammar perspective.
This is what's weird is when I have to unhide it. That's why I'm like I can't edit it. And then
by the way, we're doing that in StreamYard. The StreamYard has a back end that'll allow you to put these banners. There's a scrolling one. You can put some of the things up there. Yeah, just some clarity on that. Every once in a while we'll get somebody to pop in the back room, and I've kind of learned that ask them, hey, do you have a question for us? Yeah.
So now it's got a question. Join the show at askthepodcastcoach.com.
I think I'd actually just make that a question. I know we're doing online adding got a question ?
And suddenly we've turned into the new media show. We're doing troubleshooting. I love you, Todd.
During the show.
There we go.
Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, okay.
Sounds good.
Everybody can do that now. Awesome. That's all right. Anybody, and if you want to jump in,
and it's fine. And was the one who jumped in there. And it's actually fine. It actually helps us kind of think through. This is one of those things where thinking through the mechanics of what you're saying, this goes back to this practice idea. Sometimes we think when we say something in a certain way, it makes perfect sense to us. But then you get feedback from listeners and you're like, that's super confusing. And we want to fight that. We go, well, it's not confusing to me. Well, hey, guess what, Captain Planet? You're not the only one who you're trying to talk to your users or your listeners as well. So I think this is one of those areas you get that kind of feedback before you fire back and be like, no, I'm not changing. Let it sit for a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, maybe they got a point, maybe I could tweak this a little bit.
And think about it, going back to, Anne coming in through the back door here.
Yeah.
That's feedback.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like, but you're like, hey, wait a minute. I didn't realize that, that's confusing. I'm trying to not use the word show notes anymore because every podcaster knows what show notes are, but the listener might not. So I'm now saying episode description.
Yeah.
It's in the episode description because I'm like, from a listener standpoint, Clay over at Working Cows Podcast. By the way, if you like the show Yellowstone, you should be listening to the show. I was listening this morning about sagebrush. And like the reason some people don't herd sheep is because there's too many bears and they eat them. And it's all the inside workings of what it's like to be a rancher. And it's interesting stuff. He says, I don't think there's a way to not be less than good at the beginning. I go back and listen to my early episodes from nearly 300 episodes ago. It's, I listened to my very first podcast. It's hilarious. I had been working with musicians and somebody must have won a contest or whatever, but I'm not a huge rap fan, but yet I'm playing rap underneath the beginning of my very first episode. And it's just horrible. And I'm all over the place. And it's like, ugh. So
we all are.
We all start somewhere. Yeah, exactly.
We all are.
If let's see here, somebody's asking here, they're going to poke speaking of bears, they're going to poke this one. Well, the podcasters who use Anchor/Spotify for podcasters might not know about the show notes. Well, they might. Those are a lot of people. There was a guy in Reddit this morning. He's a high school kid, wants to start a podcast with his friends. And I was like, my only thing, like, okay, if you have zero budget, to which I kind of go, really? Like said the person that's drinking a Starbucks, I don't have the budget. If you have to go free, go with Red Circle, not Spotify for podcasters. Boy, that's a mouthful now. Although the alternative is the hosting formerly known as Anchor, and that's also as much of a mouthful. So that's it. When you start out, just realize it is a marathon, not a sprint. I think so many people stop at 7 because, wow, on my first episode, I got 15 downloads. And on episode 6, you got, 22. You're like, it's not a build it and they will come. So we do have a couple fun questions here. This is a good one. Jonathan Jones will get to yours in just a second here. But this one is, my question is, how do you delicately tell the future guest that they have to have a good mic? So if Jim shows up and sounds awful, first thing I'm going to do is go, is that, like, tap your mic? Is that on? Because sometimes that's it. And if they go, no, it's on, and it happens to be a Blue Yeti, you need to know that there's a setting that looks like a heart that they have to do on, and then they can't have that bad boy on the desk. And the way I would recommend, how do you get them to do this is, I've been so excited about having you on the show, and I just want to make sure you sound like totally professional. It's all about, I want to make you sound good. And if somebody says, well, I haven't had a problem with the other 17 shows I was on. Well, yeah, but I mean, this is, you're in the big leagues now. You're on my show. Yeah. And I don't know if I would say big leagues, but it's like, I take this really serious. And especially with you, I really want to make sure there's no distractions because you sound like you're in the bathroom. I really just want you to sound just phenomenal. And that way, I want you, hopefully this will be a great interview and I want you to share it. And, you might be less inclined to share it if you sound like you're in a fishbowl. So, I just want you to sound professional. Jim, any other ways we can spin this to get your guest to go get a microphone?
2 words: pre-call. Like, go back and listen. If some people do this, go back and listen to where they've been interviewed, if they've been interviewed before, and see how their sound is. And if it's not good, just do a pre-call and then have this conversation with them. I don't make them go out and buy expensive mics and some of those kinds of things, but I do say, let's work on getting the best sound possible from you. Sometimes it is these earbuds that you get with your phone for free or whatever. Or I don't think Apple even ships them anymore. I think you got to go buy them. But sometimes it's these. Sometimes a headset.
Right.
I find, man, there is a barrier. People just do not, and I love headsets. People do not like wearing headsets. I don't know why. Gives them great sound. When we do get good sound out of somebody, it's like it's terrible. They come in and we get it, and then we finally do get really good sound. I make a big deal about it. Like, I physically go, oh, that sounds so good. Yeah. Thank you. Like, my ears were bleeding before. This sounds great. And you see a smile on their face, and it's just a little bit of positive reinforcement. Like, yes, this is super good. And everybody's like, oh yeah, I do hear a difference in that type deal. the COVID kind of changed that for a lot of people. Now people have better sound, they know that,
Yeah.
and so it's getting easier and easier to get that done. But I definitely two tests I do when I'm checking those kinds of things. I say, okay, we're going to do a latency test. I'm going to say 1 2, and I want you to say 3 4. Okay, and they always go, yeah, and I go 1 2 3 4. Okay, well, the timing on that is I hear that will tell me, do we have latency built into the line? If I say 1 2 and then it sits there for a second, and then they go 3 4, you go, all right, there's latency in the line. Let's have you reboot, or let's have you refresh your screen, or let's have you whatever it takes, right? So that's test number 1. Super easy to do, doesn't require any equipment, but you can tell if there's latency on the line, because nothing worse when you are trying to do an interview and you're stepping all over each other, because latency causes that problem in it, right? The other test I do is super simple. I just say, hey, can you count to 10 for me? And we're doing international podcasts now, and I say in any language. I really don't care.
Right.
I just want them to do 10 things in a row to see if the numbers are dropping everywhere. I need to hear every number in the 10 to make sure that we're not having packet. That's a nerdy thing. Packets aren't dropping on the internet. So those are 2 tests that I do. 1 2 3 4, count to 10. Gives me some idea of, okay, here's how the audio quality goes. You can then, during that, you can kind of see how their lighting is, right, when they're doing that. Or the position of their camera, and you can, if you're going to use video, you can kind of move it up or down and have some recommendations.
Well, and also if they go, okay, great, 1 2 3 4 5, like, no, you got to keep your mouth by the microphone.
Well, it's funny because some people go 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. I'm like, okay, that's not really what I intended. Just 10, just normal pace. And then sometimes they'll go 1 2. You're like, okay, just 10 at a normal pace, right? I'm just trying to get, and it's funny if I don't explain to them what I'm doing, they think those are 2 really funny tests. Like, are you trying to make sure I can count, or like what's going on? I'm like, no. That is making sure we're hearing all of those. So doesn't require any special equipment. Everybody can do it. You can do it in any language. 2 great tests to do that. And then Dave, I think moving their mic around, I get this other problem where people do buy good mics and then they put them on the other side of the room.
Yep.
No, bring that thing as close to you as you can. And it's almost like it's on fire the way they bring the mic over. They're like, oh, I'm like, it's not going to bite you. Just bring it. It's fine, but making a big deal about that, like, how's this? I'm like, a little clether. How's this? A little closer. Can you bring it? They're worried about it being in the mic or in the camera or whatever.
Yeah.
No. I want it close to you, right? Let's get this thing. Then when we do get it right, making a big deal about it is good for them, because then they know they've reached that space.
That's it. Todd said I had one person tell me he shared the show with a friend, and the one episode his friend listened to was the one of our worst. Guest audio was horrible, and he told me he passed. This is where I say we can all go, well, it was the guest. It's your show. It's your brand that takes the hit when you put crappy audio on your show. And I know it's like, well, how do you tell them you sound like crap? You go, again, I want you to sound great. And, and then Coach Dave says what I distribute a how to sound great prep guide with my talent release. Yeah. Jim had it pre-call. And also I always ask people can you send me a link to an interview you were on previously? Because that's an easy way to tell if their audio is good.
It's just great to have this idea is great to have a guest guide on your website. And then you just say, if you're having a guest, hey, I've got some tips and tricks for you. Make it lighthearted, make it feel good, but you can add those things in and send it to them right away. And then it's not you and them having to have that awkward conversation where you're like, yeah, you sound kind of terrible. Give them some time to think about it. Give them some best practices. The late Mike Howard used to do this all the time with his guests on JPEG to RAW, where he'd send them this pre-guest checklist. And he found that very, very helpful. That's another really good idea.
It set expectations. You know what I mean? It's like, hey, here's the thing. So when you show up sounding like caca and I go, yeah, it's not going to work. They're okay. Todd says the one show we had a bad mic, we lost potential listeners and never again. Yeah. Unfortunately, in some cases it is a one strike, you're out. I know throw
the show away, throw it away. I know it's hard to do.
Yeah.
If it's bad, it's bad enough, throw it away and do it again. Do it again a couple weeks later when it doesn't. Yes, it sucks. Maybe you can't get that guest back, whatever. But yeah, you run that risk, right? You run that risk of like putting. I was listening to an episode of One Nation Under Whiskey this week, and their guest had really bad audio, and you could hear that they tried to run it through Auphonic or something because it was that signature wishy-washy, and it was. And Dave, it was so hard when I heard the guest just say the very first sentence, "Hey, thanks, it's great to be here. Good to see you guys." And that was like, "So great to see you guys." And I was like, finger was going to
That's
this.
it.
And I really want to hear this interview. I will tolerate it, but it's tough,
The other thing is, let's say, you put out the enormous amount of, $64 or whatever a Q2U is going for today, and you sound phenomenal, right? Jim's got a ATR 2100, less than $100. Sounds great. And then your guest shows up using something that's not that. When you put something fast next to something slow, it's really noticeable. So when you sound, great for less than $100 and they show up using your laptop microphone and it's just, again, that's not good. Yeah. In there, like, it just sounds so bad that, it's, friends don't let friends sound bad on podcasts. I don't know.
I kind of forget about this because I went to a couple years ago. I just started I'd only interview podcasters. Like I would, who had mics, who, and in the tech space, this is pretty easy. Because most of them have really good gear and really good equipment. I've kind of forgotten how spoiled I am on the tech side of things. Now, on the Gallup side of things, I'm always expecting it to be bad audio. Always. I start with the premise, this is going to be terrible. What are we going to do? Because everybody thinks, well, this is the other thing, coming out of COVID. Everybody was like, well, I've been using this for 2 years and nobody said anything. Yeah, it's because nobody, those people you've been doing it with, they're not podcasters, and they're not,
Right.
they're not tuned to. So I got labeled in the company as the audio snob.
That's it.
I don't want to talk to you, Jim, because I know you're going to criticize my audio.
It's like, I know Min Fogarty is Grammar Girl, and anytime I ever have to send her an email, I'm like, oh, this is so much pressure.
Indeed.
But on the other hand, when I went to Tennessee, whatever, a month ago, and I had 14 hours in a car listening to podcast, if somebody's podcasting from the fishbowl and you're not, then I turn up the volume to where I hear you, and they just sound like they're in another car behind me. Yeah. It's so much reverb that I can't. I'm like, that's when you're like, all right, next show. It's not going to work.
Well, this is if you're listening to us and you're not thinking about some kind of audio processing on your feed, getting it leveled, however you decide to do that, getting it leveled, getting it the right volume, getting some of those using Auphonic or the variety of other plugins, that's probably your next step as a podcaster, is to think through, what do I want to do? There's so many great tools now that are fairly inexpensive. I think I pay $11 a month for Auphonic now, and it gets me 8 or 9 hours. That's plenty for what I do. I think it's time probably to start thinking through that and say, am I getting some decent leveling? Because what you mentioned, Dave, we don't think about the leveling anymore because the software does a pretty good job. StreamYard does a pretty good job. Zoom does a pretty good job. A lot of these, other folks that do it, pretty good job, but still could probably use some leveling. Just to, you could probably use some software leveling. Not that hard anymore, right, Dave? I mean, those dropping it into something or buying an app to do it for you, not as hard as it used to be, right?
And I'm putting a link here in the episode description. Podcast.adobe.com/enhance is a no knob. If you have bad audio from a guest, and this is where using something like Squadcast or Libsyn Connect or Clean Feed or whatever you want to use, Zencaster, there's 50 of those things. If you have separate tracks, you can run their audio through something like Enhance, or if you're using Descript Studio Sound, and it'll clean it up. Now, the Enhance you have no control over that. It is simply a, you upload it and you download it and you go, is that better than it was? And if you go, yep, then use it. And if you don't, but yeah, Adobe Enhance it's cleaned up some really cool stuff for me. So it's like Studio Sound in Descript, but Studio Sound allows you to say, how much of this effect do I want? Where it, like everything else, if you go 100% on that, it's going to sound wonky. In fact, Studio Sound Descript in general needs to get their act together a little, because their interface is all over the place. And the last time I used Studio Sound, it made everybody sound like Elvis in the 50s, like this slapback echo. And I'm like, that is not what it sounded like when I was listening to the preview. And, who's got time to do it twice? Not me. So I was like, well, and I moved over to our, Isotope RX and deverbed it. And that's the magic of these tools, is you don't have to run it through multiple processes. They do it all at once. Yeah. And I can do that stuff in Isotope, but it's, it's 6 minutes to run it through deverb and 3 minutes to run it through, dialogue isolate and all these other different tools. It just takes forever. And in many cases, it's not as good.
My last guest on Home Gadget Geeks, Dr. Brian Friedlander, he's an accessibility and assistive tech expert. And we were talking about Descript and their ability now to take your audio and then make audio that sounds like you based on just text, right? And some of the crazy AI we're seeing today, as we think about some of the deep fake technology, how cool would it be, Dave, to think about? And I think we're headed in this direction. I take my audio, it might be sketchy, I drop it into this whatever it is. Yeah. We'll stop naming brand names at this point. So whatever it is, and it goes through, and if the audio is good, it just leaves it. But if there's some sketchy parts, it attempts to repair it with your audio. Like, I don't think that would be we're too far away from something like that, where it can come in and correct, say there's a skip, or you want to add to it and it's able to level it and get it close. So it doesn't sound like that. You've done those edits before where you're like, so go out to www. And then, right. And you're like, that did, that was an edit added after the fact. The sound is different, everything. But imagine it being able to go through and give you the best version of you based on what you've said, and be able to fix that in a way with your own voice. I don't think we're that far away from that. That would be kind of cool.
Well, they have a thing in Descript where you can do an overdub and it'll listen to your voice. It's close. I had
sounds pretty good.
I need to ask him what he used. Dan Class of The Bitterest Pill did an opening segment, and I don't know if it's because I was on 1.5 speed and I was in the car. I thought it was Dan, like straight up, like that thing did an amazing Dan imitation. And then at the end, he's like, oh, by the way, this is Robot Dan. This isn't Real Dan. And then Real Dan came on and I was like, but it was the one that they only had to listen to 3 seconds. So I don't know what tool that is, but I was like, ooh, that's kind of spooky. But yeah, that's the cool thing. If you mess up, I am the king of that. Like, just go to the website, schoolofpodcasting.com, and then you'll hear me later go like /38. And I'm like, wait, I need to match the connotation or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's a different space, different room environment, different tone, different cadence,
My favorite is like, this is episode 433. So we could have been going askthepodcastcoach.com/433 is where you can find the episode description. And then you go to upload it and you're like, oh crap, this is 434. I got the number. And you have to go back and find every time you said 4. Don't do that.
Go out /434. And then you're exactly. Like, doesn't even, you can totally see. So I think I hope we're getting close to some of those. Brian played a clip back that he had made out of Descript. It's close. It's really close. And,
this is where things are going to get fun. I have a friend of mine that lives in Oklahoma, and a sheriff there was fired because he was, according to him, illegally recorded talking about lynchings.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, and I'm like, you know what? I could see this guy. And what's interesting is he's suing the person because he got caught, basically. That's the part I love. He's like, hey, you can't record me talking about lynchings. I'm like, oh yeah, not the fact that you're talking about lynchings, you racist pig. Yeah. So, but I was like, you know what? In the future, somebody might go, that's not me. That's somebody sampled.
Oh, it's going to happen. No, it's going to happen. Like we've already seen some of this. We're going to have to kind of come up with some kind of digital signature.
Yeah.
That verifies. And I think, say you had an audio file that someone was saying something. I think you can inspect that file and say, is that really the person's voice, or was it mechanically made? I think we're getting to that point. That's going to happen super fast, where we get to the, somebody's like, nope, that's a digital signature. And that was, we can see that in photos. I mean, Photoshop has that. You can easily go in now to a photo and say, hey, was this thing Photoshopped? That's the digital signature. We're going to see this in AI with writing. I mean, it's pretty easy now, I think, as we've seen more and more of Chat GPT's writing, to kind of go. And the more I use Chat GPT, I'm like, okay, yeah, you can kind of tell, yeah, this was not necessarily written by a person. I think we'll see that on the audio and video side more. It already exists today, but I think we'll have better tools to say, yeah, you can pretty much instantly tell that was a digital file put together and not a real, not their real voice.
And coming up, Jonathan, your question is next, and we're going to get to Spoon and Ann. I want to talk to Jim, because he's a big giant nerd, about how do you podcast when you don't have the internet. So that'll be coming up here in a second. Just as we wrap this up, Chris says Descript or Audio Studio Sound in Descript is still better than Adobe Enhance. It is. Adobe Enhance seems, in my opinion, again, getting kind of picky, seems to take off a little bit of the upper end to where everything's just a little muffled maybe, but that's probably them just trying to remove hiss. And then Auphonic, of course, as Jim has been talking about, does a great job of leveling it out. And then, so I wanted to get to Jonathan. It says, what are your thoughts on Patreon in terms of paywalling your content? What would you recommend instead of it? Or do you like the Patreon model? Well, I talk about this in my book, Profit from Your Podcast, Proven Strategies to Turn Listeners into Livelihood. You can find that at profitfromyourpodcast.com. Patreon was the first one. It was one of the first. It's not horrible. I think, and this is where things get tricky. Did you want that back on, or was that me?
No, I was trying to turn it off.
This is where it's always icky, because I work for Libsyn. So this is how you do this and keep your integrity. I just present the facts and then let people choose. So, for instance, Libsyn owns Glow. Now with Glow.fm, you have to have a media host. They do not host the files there. The feature of Glow is when somebody signs up, there's only one tier, and you get to pick what it is. They will get an email, and when they click on that email, the device, the technology looks at your phone and goes, oh, you're on an Android phone. Here are a bunch of Android apps, especially the ones that are on your phone already, and you click on it and you subscribe. So the big feature of Glow is it's easy for the listener, but there's only one tier. Then you have Patreon. Patreon is somewhat, first mover advantage. And I want to say they take eventually 10% is what it amounts to. The downside of a private podcast, unless they fix this in Patreon, you have to teach your audience how to copy, not click on, copy their RSS feed and manually paste it into whatever app they're using. So not as easy, but they have multiple tiers, and they will host your file. Like you can upload, like if you're an awesome supporter, you don't get the pre-roll and post-roll that you do if you're a free listener for Ask the Podcast Coach. And so you can upload a file there. I forget what video version they use, but I know you can upload video to Patreon as well. You get 0 stats on that. Mm-hmm. Then there is SuperCast. SuperCast is about the same pricing range. I'm not positive you can do multiple tiers, but you could probably just set up multiple podcasts on them. They, again, are a media host, and they provide stats. And so, depending on what you're looking for, ease, if you're looking for stats, like Glow will integrate with Zapier. So if you're a person that has a membership site and you want to integrate a private podcast, there's that. So that's the other thing that I always like to point out, and this is where I kind of feel bad because I'm in some cases, urinating in your Cheerios. When you do premium content, Radiolab was trying to get up to 1%, and Radiolab's are hugely popular. The woman from Teachable said 2%, and when I talked to all the people in my book, it was around 3% of your audience is going to sign up for a premium version of your show, unless you make it like Google, where when I'm not logged into Google and I go to YouTube, I forgot just how absolutely horrendous the experience is with ads. So you either annoy your audience on the free side so that they sign up for the premium version, or you're going to get about, 3 to 5% if you're an actual, insanely popular person. But in the end, the bottom line to all that stuff is you have to tell people it's there. It's not I will mention it in episode 17. Hey, if you want to be a supporter of the show, then go on to, such and such. Well, I mentioned it once, nobody signed up. So no, you have to treat that like an ad. And speaking of that, speaking of that,
Speaking of ads, can I get a little more coffee?
you can get some more coffee, and I'm going to try to find, that'll work. I was looking for some fun, awesome supporter music. You can be an awesome supporter. I do want to say, John Spencer, I did not ignore the fact that you signed up to be a new awesome supporter, because we need new awesome supporters. But I've reached out to John to say, hey, what do you want me to pimp? So when John gets back to me with what his website is, if he has one. So John, if you're listening, I emailed you. I sent you a couple things on Patreon. Let me know what's going on. And I just realized, this is interesting. I didn't know I could do this. Oh, you didn't. I just jumped from slide 6 to slide 1, and you didn't even know it because I was on the last slide. This show is brought to you by the School of Podcasting, where you can get courses, coaching, and community. And remember, unlimited one-on-one coaching. And what do you mean when you say unlimited? I mean, you can have as much of it as you want. And it's interesting because if you have people, if you offer something that's too good to be true, nobody believes you. And I'm kind of in that slot right now where people go, so I could get a coaching call on Monday and then another one on Friday. And I'm like, yes, you can. Ask Ann. I've coached Ann. The Spotlight Supporter of the Week, Shane, the one and only Shane. We are Shane. We have double Shane today. I'm wearing a Spyberry shirt. And if you go to Radio GDR, that is his show about what was formerly East Germany. So talk about a neat show. It's very cool. Ask the Podcast Coach runs on Podpage. If you want to try Podpage, go to trypodpage.com. And if you just can't get enough Jim Cullison, go over and visit him at theaverageguy.tv. And of course, if you'd like to be an awesome supporter, because it is listener supported, and if you'd like the show to keep going, hint, 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 hint. Not that I'm threatening anyone, but sleeping in wouldn't suck on Saturday. askthepodcastcoach.com/awesome.
Dave, you and I both know we're up. We're old. We're not, if you'd say 10:30. If you're sleeping at 10:30, I'm worried about you. Yeah, I'd send somebody over. Hey, can you go check on Dave? He's still asleep. So
that is true.
No idle threats on that one.
Yes.
But if you're finding value in the podcast, I would ask on behalf of Dave, if you want to give back, do it whatever way works for you. Awesome.
John Spencer did. John, just let me know what your website
awesome.
is.
Thanks, John.
Likewise, Connie, we did the same thing with Connie about 3 months ago, and I still have emailed her a couple times. I'm like, hey, what do you want me to promote? And it's not that they are replying saying I don't have anything to promote. They're just, I'm like, it's great that they signed up. Thank you so much. I deeply appreciate it, but they sign up and ghost me.
It's this time of the year that because taxes were due on Tuesday.
That's true.
That's right. As we're recording this, it's the 22nd of April. This year in 2023, taxes were due on the 18th here in the United States, just to get all those disclaimers in.
Right.
And every time I submit my taxes, I'm like, I am dropping all of that Patreon, Google ads, because it's I always have to, it's a pain. I've got to up my level, my what I pay to have my taxes done, because I've got to report as a, whatever, blah, 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 boring stuff. So this is that time of the year I always kind of think, am I making enough doing those activities to justify the extra expenses and time and tracking it all for my taxes? It's a good question to ask, because if you're, say you got a Patreon account and you're making $1,000 or $1,200, there's a threshold in there somewhere you're supposed to report everything, but
Right.
there's a threshold in there, and you kind of go, you know what, I'm spending, or let's say it's $600, and you say, yeah, I'm probably spending $400 or $500 in time and tax software and worrying about it. You got to kind of say, do I really want to still do this? So I think it's one of those, during the tax season, it's also a good time to think like, okay, how am I not going to have this same crappy experience again next year? What do I need to do during the year to start setting out some of those whatever, so that I'm not having that same bad experience? Affiliate marketing is one of those areas you might want to think through, where I'm in that threshold where I'm thinking, well, maybe I'll just drop Patreon. And because there's not enough there to really, there is, but let's just say there isn't, and just go 100% affiliate. And because those affiliate relationships usually are not, depends on the situation, not taxable. Sometimes they are, but that's the thought, thinking through like, oh man, how can I make this easier on myself? And this is the time of the year right now, after you've just filed your taxes, to think through, hey, from a business perspective, am I doing this smartly? And then the other thing it's the time to do, not right now, because tax professionals are exhausted right now. So don't contact them. They're on vacation. But you may, if you're in a tax situation where it's really, really complicated, in about 3 or 4 weeks is the time to find a tax professional. Say, hey, I want to start giving you things so you can do my taxes next year. What do you need? And start planning that now. Use the summer here in the United States. Use the summer months to get those things going.
I did that a couple years ago, and it really comes in handy because I was tagging things as educational. And if it's not like a college or an accredited something, you're not going to claim that. Like paying $20 for a webinar is not a tax write-off. So keep that in mind. But
and we're not tax professionals.
That's
and
true.
We didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. So like, let's not, from that case, so I'm not giving you any tax advice, but if your taxes are complicated, I think it's worth it to get a pro to help you. That's advice I'd give in any country that you're in. If you can afford one, and that might be the situation where if you're spending all this money to do all these things, but it's all getting, everything you make is getting eaten up by the process, either make more or stop doing it.
That's it.
Yeah.
Spoon, better known as Ken Blanchard, says, good morning. What are the 3 top negative points of starting a new podcast on an old feed? This is an interesting question because I don't know. Here's the thing. If I do a show about electric blues music, okay, so I got people and they're loving it. They like me. They like the show. And then I go, hey, I'm not doing the show anymore. Next week, it's going to turn into a TV. We're going to do a podcast about insert popular
The Mandalorian on.
The Mandalorian. There we go. So if you see the artwork change and things like that, I just want to let you know, thanks for everyone who's been listening. You don't have to do a thing. You'll just get it automatically. So the only downside is here's the upside. You're not starting with 0 listeners. You have some audience. The bad news is some of them are going to go, I hate Disney. I'm a Star Trek guy. I'm out of here. Right. So you're going to lose some people, but there are going to be some people that stick around because, well, they think you're awesome. I mean, I had people that would listen to my podcast for musicians from the School of Podcasting. And I'd go, I didn't know you played. And they go, I don't. I just think you're entertaining. And I'm like, really? So that's the thing. The negative side, I can't really think of one. Just the fact that, can you think of a negative side of swiping,
Maybe the feedback that you're going to get. You
know?
Like if you just did it, people are like, what's going on right now? Those who don't want to listen will go away. Although you're always going to have one person who's going to hang on and remind you every week, I sure wish you'd go back to doing what you were
Yeah.
doing before. I don't know why that is.
Right.
I have always had listeners like, it's the same ones who give you feedback that you don't follow. And they're always like, I sure wish you would just listen to me. And I kind of, sometimes I want to say in a snarky way. I sure just wish you'd go listen to somebody else's podcast.
Yeah.
But man, they are hanging on. There's something you're doing for them that they just don't want to let it go. So you're going to get some of that kind of feedback. I love your. I don't know if I could name any more. I was going to go to Chat GPT and put this question in and see if it had anything I wasn't thinking of, but I can't think of anything. If you're prepping them, I think that's the best way if you're going to reuse a feed to do it. Now, it does have some in the background. Your RSS feed does have some little bit of SEO considerations in it when we think about what's in the RSS feed, that title being given, right? If you're right, I think Google's indexing that as well. It's got some smarts around, not RSS at all.
No, but here's why. Put an RSS feed into Chrome, and feel free to prove me wrong. But the last time I checked, if you put an RSS feed into Chrome, you get the code. So it's not going to, like an RSS feed, and maybe we're talking about different things, but an RSS feed is not going to come up in a Google search.
See, I don't know, actually, to be honest. So I'm not going to fight you on this one. But the mom and dad aren't going to fight today. So no, I thought there was some consideration in the URL where there's words in there that helps Google know, hey, especially during those days when Google was trying to care about podcasting for a second or two, whatever, where it was indexing the words in the RSS URL to say, hey, if I'm looking for this, you might want to go listen to this feed, right? Type deal. I could be totally wrong. That's what I thought. That's how I understood that to be happening.
I did find out, and this is another thing that's going to be a Monday show, with Apple's ratings and reviews, and we're talking slight and ever so slight, because the title of the review might come up in a Google search. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So you could tell all of your listeners, go put a review on Apple Podcasts, the best free podcast advice ever. Everybody put that in a review so that you would come up in a search. And I was like, huh, interesting. But I can't really think of anything negative.
Okay, so somebody will prove me wrong. You can drop it in the comments in either live or there on YouTube or whatever. And I wouldn't die for that. I just always thought that was a thing. The other part of that feed, if you got a feed that's got all this, I mean, that feed is still going to exist in Apple Podcasts. Make sure you're going in and changing all the descriptions and all those pieces to it to make sure, because Google has indexed it as something else, right? And there's been links from other things to that. So I guess that could be a negative. I guess there could be some negative SEO implications of getting that all back around so Google understands what kind of content is there. Maybe some work.
I did have a bad experience where there was a show about Northeast Ohio, and a friend of mine said, man, you got to listen to this. It's a podcast about WMMS. And if you ever hear me talk about the home of the buzzard, it's like back in the set, like they broke Bruce Springsteen, they broke Rush. There was this really killer station in the 70s. And I went to the website, and that was season 1. And the latest season was season 2 about an amusement park. And I was so pissed because I hit play expecting to hear about WMMS, and they're like, blah, 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 amusement park. And I'm like, you bait and switch, brr, brr, brr. And then I later found out that if I had scrolled down, I would have seen there were 4 episodes on WMMS, but I didn't see that. So that might be the tricky thing. I think it was Coach Dave said, any old promotion that says click over here to hear about Electric Blues, and then somebody shows up and it's the Mandalorian. Yeah. So they're,
Well, Chat GPT, I did put that in, says three things. Might be confusing for existing subscribers, that we already talked about that. Damage to brand identity. We talked a little bit about that, right? It's just there. And then a missed opportunity to build a new audience. It says starting a podcast in an old feed may also mean missing out on the opportunity to build a new audience for the new content. Starting a new feed for the new podcast may allow you to target a specific audience and better optimize your marketing and promotion efforts. That may not be the best description for that, because as I kind of read that, I go, well, okay, yeah, they're like, I think what we're talking about a little bit, where people know that as one thing and now it's something different from a titling perspective, whatever. So
yeah, Jack says when he searched for the Audacity to podcast, if you put things in quotation marks, yes, an RSS feed will come up in search. Maybe that's just me. I haven't put quotation marks in. Usually searches are decent, but and then Chris brought up a great point. A Libsyn RSS feed into Chrome spits out the code. Captivate, so that may be based on who you're hosting with. Captivate gives you a much more readable experience. So
what the engine is looking for when it sees RSS, what it's supposed to do.
Right? Yeah. Jack says that wasn't in quotes, so that's interesting. Okay. He says the nice thing about it, you can add a ton of SEO into an RSS feed, just make an SEO tag, and I don't think it'll bother the podcatchers. That's one where I'm like, be careful about throwing stuff that might make your feed invalid.
I think I still would just do a new feed and then use the second feed to promote, use the old feed to promote
the second one.
Feed.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. Yep, absolutely. And then later, if the show's been if show A's been dead for a while, then just redirect it to the new one.
It might be easier that way, just to be honest. You could go back and unwind the old feed. Now, if they're similar, if they're similar in content and you're going to leave those old podcasts out for a long time. Yeah. Well, then then maybe go through the work to rebrand. But if you're going to try to treat it like a new feed and go in and remove all the old podcasts and stuff just to get the benefit of the listeners, I think I'd create a couple episodes to point them over to the new. Hey, did you know you're good at this, Dave?
Yeah.
Hey, do you know I have a new podcast? Come over here and see that. Right. I think I might go that route.
Yeah. All right. So here's a fun one, Jim. I think you were out when we talked about this. So this is from Anne, but first.
And now, he's been waiting for this. It's time for Jim to get his nerd on.
This might be it's a technology issue. Anne lives in the middle of, where the deer and the antelope play. You know what I mean? She's in the middle of cow country. She wants to interview female ranchers. So definitely your Clay and Anne are both in the school of podcasting. My rancher friends only have access to an iPhone with earbuds. So in some cases, we're talking like no internet because they're in the middle of nowhere. Not much I can do. But here's the thing. If all you can do is, get audio from an earbud recording, that is better than nothing. And it may not be what you want. There's all sorts of weird sex jokes that just went through my head. You can't always get what you want, but sometimes you get what you need. And so, I started in the basement next to a water heater. Not really what I would recommend, but that's where I was. And you start where you are to get to where you want to go. Jim,
are we assuming no internet? Or we're making that assumption?
Let's start there, and then we'll go up. Because we suggested Squadcast, and I didn't know this. Squadcast has an up download limit, and because it's uploading the file as you record the new one. And she tried it, and it was like, yeah, your internet's too slow. So we might want to assume, no internet.
Right. Well, one, forget about audio, forget about the video on this. Although you don't necessarily have to. I think you're almost creating a new genre of the way to do it if you have no internet. So we'll just make that assumption for a second. So script it out, and you can record. You could use the phone with earbuds. So if you're going to do it this way, an iPhone placed correctly, or even an Android, that's a good one, placed correctly in front of you, has a pretty good mic on it. And so I may even do away with the earbuds and just talk right into it. Script it out the best that you can, and then you'll have to get video files from both. I mean, on both those phones, you can just do recordings. Pull those in. It's a lot of work, right? If you're going to do it that way. But it might be a way of getting, now, not reading the script, but you could record asking questions and then getting answers on that. And again, it's a lot of work to put those together. But if you have no internet, it's still possible to get it done. Just a lot of work up front.
That's it. It's because you don't have that one piece, it makes things a little harder. And so Elsie Escobar lives in the middle of nowhere, North Carolina, up in the mountains. And for the longest time, she had no internet. Like she would have to go to town to upload stuff. And so how they did the feed was her and Rob would get on the phone. Like they would call each other so they could hear each other. And this is where, sure, that works for Elsie because she's not a giant nerd, but she's been in podcasting for a while. And now you're asking a rancher, hey, open up, what's the one thing on a Mac? There's QuickTime. Open up QuickTime and make a recording. Record this to your computer. Oh, and when you're done, you can use something like WeSendIt.com or Dropbox or Google Drive to upload that file. And then you got to put the two together. It's not impossible. It's just there's a little more of a learning curve there. And especially with your guests, that could be, in some cases, that's, so
it's a way to do it. Let's assume for a second you have some decent internet. And we're just talking about, I think the genesis of this question was around microphones and getting good sound.
Right.
And so oftentimes you can, and there's lots of great ways to get pretty good sound out of an iPhone or an Android phone, even with the earbuds. But definitely have them hold this microphone as they're talking if that's all you've got.
Right.
I hear a lot of, and this used to happen a lot, I would get folks, this thing will rub on collars, or sometimes if you're wearing jewelry around here, and it'll as you're moving around, it'll tap, 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 tap. You actually got to get this thing up in the air and get it close to get it, close. I've known people who've made a little over the ear thing that then this clips onto, so it just kind of sits there like this. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but they're probably not using video in this case to get it done. But get that microphone as close as you can. Or in this case, again, if you're using the phone, just use good mic technique and get that phone as close to as you can and do it this way. If you're not using the video, get that phone right there.
I would actually say hold it up to your ear, because now your mouth is that much closer as opposed to this where you might but because I've had people once. I had Scott Johnson. This is back in the days of Skype, and we were connecting, and he said, look, I've got to shut down my computer. I've got a hurricane coming in. I'll call you back. I'm going to call you back on the phone. And so he connected. He was still somehow on Wi-Fi, but he'd shut down most of his stuff. And I said, I thought you said you're going to call me back on your phone. He goes, I am on my phone. And I go, really? And because he was holding it up to his mouth, it really didn't sound that bad. So it's just tricky. It's something I haven't run into. And now with Clay and Ann and from the ranching world at the School of Podcasting, these are things I'm like, one option that isn't as fun. And again, it kind of requires your guest to, and I've only used it with podcasters, so that's the problem. There's a thing called Rumble Studio. Again, link in the episode description, that the goal of it is an asynchronous, meaning I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk. So it's not a live interview, but you could have question number 1, question number 2. I did an episode on, should you use a newsletter for your podcast? And I had James Cridlin, who's on the other side of the pond, and a couple other people that weren't in my time zone. And they answered those questions there. And then I just stitched them together. Was it more work? Yep. But I had a lot of people go, that was really cool. So those things that take a little more work sometimes are actually, better. But,
this would be a good use of what we were talking about earlier with Descript and the voices.
Yeah.
So if you could have them, if you could get them to train, and you would train right on Descript, and then you would do this kind of conversation where they're sending things in to build the initial kind of transcript, so to speak.
Yeah.
Then you could go in and edit the transcript to get it exactly the way that you wanted it in the interview, and then have Descript redo the audio in both voices so that it makes it so it sounds consistent and good and like you're doing it there. So I think, again, that's a lot of work. In 20 minutes of audio is going to take you probably 3 hours, maybe 4, depending on how good you are. But
Rich says big bangly, that's a new word, necklaces. are the worst for earbud mics. Yep.
They are.
And then Dave says, with no internet, they're probably in the same room. That's the problem. They're not in the same room, and we're out in the middle of like Montana, where the guest you're talking to is like a distance away.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky situation.
Yeah.
And
If I were going to do that though, Dave, or maybe I was going to drive to him and I want to do is set up a quick studio, maybe I'm going to go travel to them.
yeah.
I definitely get 2 of those. Yeah. What are you showing there?
Well, here's the thing. They have this is the Zoom PodTrack P4, but just announced this week, Rode came out with a bunch of little baby Rodecasters. So because the Rodecaster takes up my desk, it pretty most part takes up about 40% of my desk, and they came out with the Rodecaster Duo. So not as many. It has 2 inputs as opposed to 4, less channels, and it's like. But the thing is, the Rodecaster's $800. This one I was like, oh, cool, $400, 5, and I was like, But it's got all the chocolatey goodness in there with all the effects and stuff.
I think the P4 would be better for this scenario because I would recommend if you're going to them, don't go in their house to do this. Stay outside, and if you get some headset mics that now you. Quiet outside.
Yeah.
There's cows moving in the background, chickens, like some of those kinds of things. But we recently have been, I've got one of my hosts is down in Mexico. She's actually using a microphone like this, but she's out on her patio and there's absolutely no reverb because she's outside. Now it's quiet out there, so it works, but that could be a great outside podcast. Pull up, plug some things in, each have a headset, spend some time talking. You'd want to practice this before you try it. But I've never done that, but I could see how that could kind of work. And then you could record these things together, take your audio file, and you're done. So
I forget the show, but there was someone I met. They did a bird podcast, and all their stuff was recorded outside.
Yeah.
And on one, it's so again going back to the whole, no, it needs to be in a studio where there's no reverb. Like, no, you felt like you were with them. I did a weight loss show, and occasionally I would walk around a park or whatever and just do my podcast into, I forget what microphone I was using, but nonetheless, my audience would say, man, I feel like I'm on the trail with you walking. So
it sounds different.
Yeah.
You got to be careful for wind, right? You can't go out on a windy day because you're going to get that.
Right.
You're going to get that wind sound. But
and dogs. That was
dogs barking.
I had people that thought it was quite funny that I was walking along and I'm talking and I'm doing my podcast and this dog came out of nowhere and I was like, nah. And they're like, oh, that was awesome. So it's great. Coach Dave says, I use Rumble Studio. It's good for reaching large audiences and gathering a lot of content, challenging to make them sound seamless and sync energy and tone. Yeah, when I did mine, I did a narrative style. So this is a case where I had I had everybody answer the same questions. That helped. And then I was able to, anywhere there was a missing piece of the story, that's where I would come in and narrate it and pass it off to the next person. It's an interesting strategy because what happens then if you interview, let's say 4 people on the same subject and they all go to your Rumble Studio and they answer it, you can then, in theory, ask those 4 people to promote their episode, and they may, of course, or may not, but that's an old blogging strategy where you interview a bunch of influencers and then get them to share their blog post, which isn't really theirs, it's yours, that whole 9 yards. But it's an interesting concept. But I originally was not a fan of Rumble Studio. I was kind of like, because to me, the biggest takeaway of an interview is the relationship you build with that person. And when you do it asynchronously, it's definitely not anywhere near the connection you get from somebody that you're face to face with. But again, sometimes there was one person I wanted to get on and I just communicating with that person because we're on such different time zones. We just kept missing each other. And I was like, I should have used Rumble Studio for that. So, always fun. John is in the chat room. Good. John, what is your website, my friend? You sent a reply via email. All right. Well, we will promote the snot out of you then next week. I want to blow your big. Well, we can shout you out now. Let me see if I have that real quick. Here we go. His website. We will mention this next week as well. I have nothing to promote yet. Okay, John. Well, we will promote whatever you want to promote when you promote. So there you go. But thank you so much for your support. You should be like John and go to askthepodcastcoach.com/awesome and be an awesome supporter today. So Jim, let's see, anything else in the chat room before we wrap things up? No, I think we're going to end early today.
Oh, that'll be different.
It is weird. I was like, well, I could, yeah.
It'll be nice. I got to go help somebody move. One of my favorite, I'm being sarcastic, one of my favorite things to do. So we can go on for another hour or two. That'd be fine.
They didn't even promise like pizza and beer or anything? Or?
Oh, I think they'll have something, but just not one of my favorite. Moving, this is why Sarah wanted to move from here, and I just drug my feet until she gave up. Just like, I don't want to move things. Just not interested.
Randy Cantrell, a listener of the show, posted pictures of the Yellow Studio version 4, and it's just boxes in a room at this point.
Yeah, he's in the move. Yeah, you do those kinds of moves maybe once. I just don't. I'm just not a big fan of it. There's too much stuff.
Yeah, so. if you haven't given us a thumbs up, subscribe, that whole 9 yards, that would be. Are
you playing the music? Are you playing the music?
I will be playing the music now. I'm there. It is. It's slowly coming up. I never make this as loud as it needs to be. When I listen back to the recording, I'm like, you can barely hear it. So. Yeah, Jim, what's coming up on the Average Guy .tv?
Dr. Brian Friedlander joins us. He's a assistive tech expert and spending a lot of time thinking about how we can use technology to help people that don't have that have disabilities. And so he was on. We spent some time talking about all that cool stuff. It's available now. HomeGadgetGeeks.com.
And on the School of Podcasting, I went looking for a new podcast. And holy cow, did I hear things. We're going to talk about how ratings and reviews do not help you get found in Apple Podcasts. That's per Apple. We're going to talk just a lot of things I heard that were just like, wow, this is that. Also, the question of the month, if you haven't answered it yet, schoolofpodcasting.com/question is when you look at a podcast, we all know that the length of a podcast, it should be as long as it needs to be and not any longer than that. But like when you see a podcast and it's blank amount of time, that you either go, oh, perfect, or if it's longer, do you go, I'm not going to hit play on that. So what's the best time? What's the best length of a podcast for you? I need your answer today. Ask the schoolofpodcasting.com/question. We'll do that. Don't forget to like, subscribe, ring the bell, that whole 9 yards right now if you're watching this on YouTube. And if you're not watching this on YouTube, then go to askthepodcastcoach.com/follow and follow the show. Rate and review, because, it helps us get found. Actually, no, it doesn't. But
but it feels good.
It does feel good.
It feels good. So do it.
We'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.